So we welcome Michael tonight. Now, before we begin our meeting, let's bow our heads for a prayer. Thank you, Father in heaven, for this opportunity to learn more about the evidence that you are the great creator of this world and that you can recreate in our lives hope for the future. We ask you to bless each one here. We're not here to criticize scientists. We're not here to run anybody down. We're just here to look at some of the evidence that helps give us a belief system that will point us toward the Creator. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
I'll take that. No, because we need to put it down here. Right there. All right, before we launch into that, let me just say a few words. We've got a lot of books and DVDs out there on the table, and since I have learned just how much authority I have over the organization, I told Joe that tonight we're going to have a 50% off almost everything out there sale. So any book that has a book or DVD that has a, whatever the sticker is, half off of that. If it all adds up to something and 50 cents, we'll round it up to the nearest dollar, but you're getting it half off anyway, so 50 cents shouldn't be a problem for you. And we have several videos that were produced by, just specifically for the Arizona Origin Science Association a few years back. There's 5 in this set. And what I'm going to offer you for this, because this is a little bit different, is the first video. If you want to buy just one, it's $5. Every other video after that is $3. But if you want to buy the whole set of 5, it's $15. They're $3 a piece if you buy all 5. So where else can you get, for $15, get 5 videos? They're all about an hour or more in length from 5 different people, and they're all really good informational, inspirational stuff. So I highly recommend you check that out, but please help him out by helping him move some of that inventory so he's not hurting his back all the time when he has to, load these things around. Trying to help you, Joe. All right, there is one more thing I want to get here just because I might need it later. A laser pointer and a remote. All right. I can just set that right there. And we are off and running. All right. The title of this talk is called Road Trip 2 because I have the first road trip talk I put together about 12 years ago, back in 2011. Was focused mostly on just the Four Corners region. But we've made several trips up into Utah, and I finally decided that, hey, I have enough, I'll do Utah as a whole separate road trip. So I named this Road Trip 2, Exploring Utah's National Parks and Monuments, and a few state parks, also from a biblical worldview, of course, okay? So here is a map of Utah, and it says that all maps and satellite images are courtesy of Google Maps or Google Earth. And I think that sometimes when I get to travel up that way, I think that Utah, the Beehive State, should have been named Utah, the Awesome Geology State. Okay. Now Arizona has a lot of incredible geology. We have the Grand Canyon, of course. You can't get much grander than that. But Utah has a lot of interesting things to see. And here is the route that we're going to take. Now I have a little bit of a disclaimer, Joe. This was not a road trip. This is a various other road trips that we've been over. I mean, we probably made 10 or more trips into Utah. And so we've hit these various places here. And so what I did was I thought, well, if I had to put it into one road trip, would it be possible? Yes, it would be possible. If you wanted to see all of these places here that we're going to see today, a week would not give you enough time, okay? So give yourself 2 weeks, and then you got to plan on spending just a few hours in each location before you move on. So but feasibly, it could be done. Now I have a few video slides with some audio, so we're going to run a little audio check just to make sure that all the audio is still working. Does anybody recognize what movie this might have come from? Okay. Princess Bride. Okay, some people know about that. All right, so.
Hey, hello in there. Hey. What's so important? What you got here that's worth living for?
And you know the answer?
Oh,
And we all know where true love comes from, right? Okay, so I was asked, what's the connection? It's like, well, true love. God tells us that he loves us in his word. If he loves us, then as a premise, then he would not lie to us. So what he gives us in his word must be truthful, okay? And if he's giving us history in the Bible, then that would be true history. And whatever scientific points that are touched upon in that history would have to be true as well, okay? But there are some people who have a real hard time believing the Bible, especially the accounts in Genesis. So we're here to help you see that there is some really, really good substantive reason for believing in Genesis the way it is written, the way it is to be understood. Now, by way of introduction, this is a picture of my wife and myself toasting our 10th anniversary in Soda Springs, Idaho, where naturally carbonated soda water comes out of the ground, and the pioneers on the Oregon Trail drank from the same springs. A little bit of text here. This is, that's me, Michael J. J stands for Jerome. I was not named after St. Jerome or the town of Jerome, just Jerome. I was born August 10th, 1955 at the Good Samaritan Hospital in Portland. I had my born-again experience in January of 1981 after barely getting through the worst year of my life, 1980. Prior to that, I had served in the United States Navy for 4 years, from 73 to 77. Got out of the Navy, joined the Army National Guard. I was first an anti-tank missile gunner, and then I was the company clerk. I went on to graduate from Portland State University in December of 1986 with a degree in elementary education. I taught in Oregon public schools for a little over 17 years, and I, as was mentioned, currently serve as the president of the Arizona Origin Science Association. Like Joseph, I also coordinate meetings, but my meetings are held in Payson and in Show Low. So I have Gila County and Navajo County. So, to start off with, 2 Peter 3:3, knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. Verse 5, for this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water. Okay, so, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. Now, catch verse 7. But the heavens and the earth, which are now, by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. So there are people out there who deny that there was ever a biblical flood. And one of the main reasons they deny that is because the flood implies judgment. And the judgment implies that God has judged the world once in the past, and he says he's going to judge it again. Well, if you don't want to be judged, you have two choices. You either get in line with the judge, or you live your life pretending that the judge doesn't exist. Okay? And that's what a lot of people are exposed to today. And a lot of people that we know are only exposed to one side of the story, and they really haven't heard the evidence to support the biblical account. Evidence for a global catastrophic flood is one of the strongest proofs that, are you ready for this? A, the Bible's account of history and God's dealings with mankind are trustworthy. B, therefore God's promise of a coming judgment upon the earth is certain as well. And C, therefore all mankind is accountable to the Creator and Judge, who has also provided salvation through Jesus Christ. So, let's think about how this applies as we're trying to witness to people who have already the mindset, the worldview that, well, I don't believe the Bible because the Bible is just a collection of stories and it's not really accurate historically or scientifically or whatever. Then before these people are going to accept that God has given them a Savior, Jesus Christ, and that they need to accept him, they need to have their worldview adjusted, okay? And you don't go up to somebody and smack them over the head and say, you ought to believe the way I believe, you know, you need to believe the Bible. Well, I don't believe the Bible. Well, you should just believe it anyway. Then that would be asking them to be counterintuitive. I want you to believe something that you don't believe, okay? Now, their belief is in error, but again, to turn that around, it needs more than just overwhelming them with facts. They need to show, first of all, that you care about them, and that you gently and respectfully share things with them that will help them to say, maybe there is another way to look at things. Now, this person here, Ray Troll, has created this little nifty little illustration here about the different layers of rocks. And you may have heard of some of these names here, and these are the millions of years associated with it. And that's kind of the evolutionist model, the skeptical model. But what I'm going to introduce you to tonight is something a little bit different. This is a picture of Dr. Taz Walker. He's with Creation Ministries International in Australia. He is an engineer. He's worked in the oil petroleum industry, but he's really strong in the area of geology. And several years ago, he was featured in this video called Biblical Geology, Properly Understanding the Rocks, produced by Answers in Genesis. Now, around this time, Mr. Walker here created what has come to be known as the biblical geologic model. And Christian geologists from a variety of different places all around the world have recognized this and say, wow, this really makes good sense. So instead of understanding all the rock layers that exist in terms of millions of years for this one, then millions of years more for this one, and millions of years more for this one, he says that we can understand the rock layers based upon what was happening in Earth's history based upon the flood. Now, to start with, let me just see here. So we have the primordial. This would have been at the first day when there was just nothing but water. And then we have the ensuing. This is where God brings the land out of the water. It says the dry lands were gathered in one place and the waters were gathered into another place. Then you have the derivative. This is where he creates the, all the stuff in the atmosphere and things like this. Then we have the biotic, and that's where he's putting life onto the planet, okay? Now, geologically, there was, a fair amount of stuff going on. We have water, and now land's coming out, and everything's forming, and we have trees growing and stuff like this. So for that, you need to have soil. The soil has to be ready with nutrients and stuff like this. But the worms and the bugs weren't created yet. That's going to come, all right? So anyway, then it all gets together, and you have the created earth. Now, from the time up until the flood, this would even include the fall, biblical history does not tell us that there was a lot happening geologically. Things were, pretty stable from a geological standpoint. But then you have the flood, okay? So now the flood lasts 1 year, but during that 1 year, there was more geologic processes going on than at any other time in Earth's history. So I'm going to pivot to the right now. And see, I have to point to this because if I point to the screen, oh, hey, it actually shows up pretty well over there. Anyway, during the flood, okay, you have several different phases. The first 40 days were the eruptive phase. This is when the fountains of the great deep were bursting forth. Now, that implies massive earth movements, okay, crustal plates splitting apart and water coming out of the middle of the earth, okay, the fountains of the great deep. And those would have been hot because we know that the mantle in the earth is very hot. So you would have had super hot jets of water coming out and probably shooting thousands of feet into the atmosphere, which would also account for 40 days of rain, right? Then, after 40 days, the ark has now been lifted off the earth. It continues to rise for another 50 days. This is called the ascending phase. And after those 90 days, you have reaching at day 150, the zenithic phase. It's reaching its height. Now, during this phase here is where all the mountains have been covered. Okay, now all the land has been covered, and the tides are going to be harmonic. You have the earth doing all kinds of things going on. And then it says, the fountains of the deep were closed and the floodgates of the sky were closed, and then the water began to drain off the earth. So then you have, this is the abeta phase. This is where as the mountains rise up and the continents are formed, the water is going to start rushing off the continents to go back into the ocean basins. As it goes out, it's going to be scouring all this freshly laid sediment that was laid down. It's going to be stripping it off because it's all soft and it's going to be in big layers, and it's going to be taking out into the ocean. After a while, those big sheets of water are going to be channelized, and you're going to have the dispersive phase. This is when your river valleys and things are made, canyons and stuff like that. And then after Noah gets off the ark, after his 7 months, then you have a post-flood era. Okay, that's a long period of time, but now you have things slowing down. Okay, and there's a lot of evidence that right immediately after the flood, there was a lot of things still happening. The earth was still very unstable because it had just gone through a tremendous volcanic geologic upheaval. And so you're going to have a lot of earthquakes and things going off. This is when the Ice Age would have started, because then we could spend a whole hour just talking about the mechanics of the Ice Age and things like that. But eventually, it'll start subsiding. The Ice Age will end, and you'll have this modern phase where things are kind of going at a much slower pace than they were. It wasn't just immediately slowing down, it was an exponential decline for things to slow down. So to borrow an illustration from the Answers in Genesis people, we are going to put on biblical glasses. So that's a metaphor for everything that we examine. We're going to examine from the starting point that the Bible is true, okay? We don't have to be skeptical of the Bible. We're going to say, I believe the Bible is true. So when I look at something, I'm going to start with the premise that the account of the global flood is true. And when I look at things around there, I'm going to say, I wonder at what point in the flood that happened. I wonder what processes were involved in this mountain being formed, or this valley being formed, or whatever it is you see. And we can do that with every area of study: biology, astronomy, the whole works. But tonight we're going to focus on geology. So I have read Proverbs through many, many times, and so long ago I read it and I came across this verse and it just struck me in a different way. Proverbs 18:17, the first to plead his case seems right until another comes and examines him. There are many people in the world who have only heard the evolutionary side of the story. That's all they ever taught in their school system, and they don't really understand that there is another way to view it. But if another person comes along and says, you know, there is another way to look at that, you know, there is other evidence that's not being considered in your evaluation. And if you do it, you know, kindly and gently, they might say, well, what evidence is that? And then you can say, I'm glad you asked. Let me share a little bit with you, okay? So, going back to our map, here's Utah. We're going to start way down in the southeast corner of Utah at Natural Bridges National Monument, okay? Now, technically, I could have started at Goosenecks State Park, but I did cover that one in my Four Corners talk, okay? And this is the San Juan River, and that's why they call it the Goosenecks. It's a meander. It's called an incised meander, but that's for another talk, another time. But we're going to start at Natural Bridges National Monument. First time my wife and I visited there was in March. It had snowed the day before, and there was this little tiny snowman somebody put up there. How many of you have been to Natural Bridges National Monument in southeast Utah? Oh, highly recommended. So here's a map, official government map. You come in and it's a one-way loop. Once you start, you go one way, and you'll come to Sipapu Bridge first, Kachina Bridge, Owachamo Bridge, and then you can loop again or go back out, all right? So we're going to look at each of these natural bridges here. When you first get a view of Sipapu Bridge, this is what it looks like. A little hard to see, but we'll zoom in a little bit closer. Do you see it now in the center there? Okay. Here is the official park sign that they have describing it, and it says here, I'll just jump down to this part here, slowly exposed by meandering streams. So what they assume is that this was all solid rock, and then you had a little stream, okay, coming through, and it's like, okay, this little stream is supposed to cut enormous holes in the rock. Well, right away it seemed a little suspicious. If you go to their website, okay, nature.nps.gov/geology parks, here's what they say happened, that you had the initial phase, which has this little oxbow shape coming down this way, and then at some point it breached and cut through this way, and so now this is an abandoned section of the bridge. Now, getting back to actual pictures. So here it is. Sipapu Bridge measures 220 feet tall, and it measures 268 feet across. The Capitol building in Washington, D.C., where Congress meets, could fit under this. And maybe we'd be better off if they were, but we won't go into that, okay. Now, when you stand underneath it, you can't photograph the whole thing. I mean, you'd have to have a really super special wide-angle lens. But this is a Google Earth photograph. Now, I'm going to show you how the alleged stream come down this way, and then it looped around this way, and then over, and then back out. Now, let's suppose that at some point in time, this breach actually happens here, okay? And it starts coming through this way. Here's what you have to think about. You can account for the erosion from this point going down and carving out the rest of this area here. Because once it starts coming through, the water is going to be down. It's not going to be going up and taking out any of this, okay? So how would the evolutionist, the naturalist, okay, the skeptic who doesn't believe in a global flood, he might be able to say, okay, maybe you can come up with a story to convince me of this, but how do you, this is supposed to be solid rock. How would you account for the evacuation of all of this solid rock up here? Because water doesn't go climb uphill and erode solid rock, okay? However, if all of this was soft sediment immediately after the flood tearing through here, and you've got, it's going to be hundreds of feet deep, okay, and it's going to be carving these things, then forming that breach and forming that tunnel would have been no problem at all. So we're talking about approximately 220 feet of rock, but again, it's accounting for that portion right there that the evolutionist cannot account for in his model of how this would have formed. So there's the first evidence we have right there. If you were to take a hike through this area, you'll see a lot of these features here. The black stripes are what we call desert varnish. It's usually caused by the element manganese, staining it. Then it brings us to Kachina Bridge. Now this is from the viewpoint of Kachina Bridge. This is a little bit closer look. Kachina Bridge is 210 feet tall and 204 feet wide, smaller than the other. Here is their official sign. And it's at the confluence where two streams actually come together. And what they say about this is that flash floods have worn away at the abutment and gravity pulls at the loose rocks. So here is their official on the website. They have this, and it shows that originally it came this way and emptied here, and Armstrong came up this way, and then they both met and went through. And then over here, it breached at this point. So now this is abandoned, and you have a stream coming this way and a stream coming this way, supposedly, all right? Let's go back to Google Earth, take a look. Now, I'm going to trace the routes of the two streams, okay? Comes down this way and the other, and they meet and they go out this way. And then what happens supposedly is that it diverts and becomes right through here. So let's take a peek down at Kachina Bridge. You hike out to it. There is a stream flowing at certain times of the year, so you have to get there. Now, notice in the circle, that area right there. In June of 1992, a 4,000-ton slab of rock fell off the bridge and landed on the ground right there, okay? These occasional flash floods are not taking any of that rock away. It's still sitting there in a pile, okay? So what accounts for the entire formation of the bridge, okay? Because little streams are not moving big piles of rock. Now, a little close-up view, there it is. Now, there's something even more interesting. Here's a picture of my wife standing under the bridge, and she's looking at this spot right there on the rock wall. If you get up close enough to it, you will see this. And it may be hard to see on either of these two screens, but I'm going to show you the petroglyph that is on this wall. It looks like that. And people have identified that as a sauropod dinosaur, four-legged, long-necked, long-tailed dinosaur. We'll take it out again and bring it back again. Now, so the people who say, wait a minute, how could somebody have carved a dinosaur picture? It must have been vandals. It must have been somebody else doing this, okay? Because the ancient people, the Anasazis who lived in that region, would not have carved a dinosaur. They would have never seen one because they died 60 million years ago, right? So this article by Answers in Genesis talks about some people, Sentner and Cole, who went there and did some investigation. And other secular paleontologists have gone back in there, and they say, as far as we can tell, these petroglyphs are all authentic. They date from about the same era. They have to all be at least 100 years old. They can tell this because of the oxidation that has happened to the rocks. So they say, well, it looks like they were all made at the same time, but we have no idea what this is supposed to be a drawing of, okay? That mankind and dinosaurs would have actually lived together. So that kind of baffles them a little bit. But if you go to the National Monument there, you will not find a park ranger or a sign or anything that tells you all about that petroglyph, because they don't want to have to answer questions about why is there a dinosaur petroglyph down there, okay? If you continue to walk around, you'll see these layers. They're tilted. This is a boundary between two different types of rock layers. You can see it's very flat, very horizontal. That indicates that they were laid down by water, because if it was wind blowing over millions of years, it should look like a dune on top of a dune on top of a dune, but it doesn't. They're all very flat and very straight. You might even run into an indigenous creature. Eventually, you will find your way around at Owachimo Bridge. This is from the bottom side looking back towards the parking lot. This is from the parking lot looking out. Owachimo Bridge is 106 feet high and 180 feet across. Now, how much water would have to move through that hole to carve that out? Do you think an occasional southwestern monsoon rain would do that? Okay. And again, even if you had an occasional monsoon rain, it might only run, even if it ran knee deep or waist deep, How do you account for 106 feet of erosion out of this solid rock? So here's what it says on the website. Couple different features here. You had this creek coming this way, this one this way, then it breaches down here at one point, and then it breaches over here at another point. Okay, so you have all these other abandoned channels. So let's go to our biblical geologic model. When would this have taken place? Well, all of the layers forming these bridges would have been laid down during this ascending phase as these floodwaters are covering the earth and these fountains of deep are ripping up the crust as they're coming out, and the oceans are sloshing around. And we've seen videos of tsunamis and what they can do and how they can destroy things just moving across the surface of the land. They're laying down all these sediments. Then, at the dispersive phase, this is when the channelized phase, this is as the water is flowing off the continents, it gets down into these channels and it starts just carving away because these sediments are still going to be relatively soft. So moving water going through soft sediments will create canyons very easily, and it will leave bridges like this, which makes more sense. That or the millions of years and a little stream and some occasional monsoons, okay? You see the problem here. They have to give it lots of time, but they can't give it a catastrophic process, because if they do, that resembles Noah flood, and they don't want to go to there. And so they say, well, it's just occasional monsoons or summer rains or what have you. But, you know, a fourth grader would be able to look at this and say, that doesn't add up. You know, that much rain, that much water couldn't take away that much solid rock. And where did all that solid rock go? It's nowhere to be found. Well, the Bible would say, well, if you study the biblical model, you'd say it's all out in the ocean somewhere. Let's move to our next point, Canyonlands National Park. Anybody been to Canyonlands National Park? A few, okay, very good. Here is a satellite image of what it looks like. Kind of hard to see some of the features, but you see a lot of little movements and wiggles and squiggles and things like that. Canyonlands is located at the confluence or the merging of the Colorado River and the Green River up in northern Utah. As you drive in, you'll see these two rock formations. They're known as the Monitor and the Merrimack. Okay, and this is a place that's very popular to go to. This is Mesa Arch, which is in a lot of pictures, and it's always from the west looking to the east. And there's a reason for that, and that is because on the east side there is about a 2,000-foot cliff on the other side. You can't walk around to the other side of Mesa Arch. And here's another view of it a little closer. So here's Mesa Arch up here, and it just goes down into the valley floor down there. So, and Google Earth will help you. As you look through, you can see the area behind it. It's a big drop down, but we're going to look at some of this. My wife and I took a road trip to Kentucky last September, and on the way back we stopped, and I was able to capture this photo of the sun rising. But when you look out from the Green River overlook now, you're looking out in kind of a south-southwesterly direction. You'll see this plateau on the horizon, nice and flat, right? Okay. Now, the next eroded layer is down here, going this way. And then you see all these other little canyons going here and here and here and here and here. But here is where the river flows, right up there. So what carved out this? What carved out this? What carved out this? There's no stream going into it, okay? There's no evidence of a waterfall or a stream. Some other process had to carve those side canyons. Here's another view of what it looks like. Now, this is where some scientists recently said, okay, there's got to be a way to explain this, and they did some experiments with something that is called groundwater sapping. Okay, groundwater sapping. What is groundwater sapping? Well, again, if we start with the biblical model, all of these layers of mud would have been laid down, and they would still have a lot of water in them. As that water compresses, it's going to find a way to squeeze itself out, if it has a place to go. Well, if the Green River has carved a little canyon here, now the water has a place to evacuate out into, and as it's going out, it's going to be pulling some of that ground with it. So to test that theory, some scientists took a bunch of sandy-like material. They laid it in a special trough that was tilted this way, and they kept it saturated with water, and they had an opening spot over here. And they just ran a time-lapse photography on this. They kept the water, or they kept the soil, the sandy soil, soft, okay? Now, I'm going to start it, and you're going to look at a time-lapse of what's happening here. Okay, this is what it looks like. This is day one. Up in the upper left-hand corner, it says day one. Now, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 hours. And look how as that water is evacuated, as it's just kind of oozing its way out, it's taking this soft sediment with it. Day 2, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24 hours. Now we're into day 3, still continuing to go. They changed the camera angle slightly here. So this is what happens when you have enough water-saturated sediments. If it has a place for the pressure to take the water out, as it leaves, it's going to be pulling uncemented rock with it. Now that's a small scale, but when you compare what you see here to what Canyonlands looks like, you see the same sort of features, obviously on a much, much, much larger scale. So, going back to our biblical geologic model. Again, the sediments are laid down during the ascending phase, and all these extra canyons are cut during the dispersive phase. Next, we move up to Arches National Park, just up the highway from there. There's a picture of my wife and I on our first visit way back many years ago. You come into the park. Now it's getting so busy that you have to have, during the summer, you have to have advanced reservations. They'll let you in like they'll give you a 1-hour window to come in so that they can kind of monitor and not have too much traffic flow, because that traffic can back up quite a ways into that parking lot. You go into Park Avenue, a place that's one of the first areas you come to, and you look at the different rock formations. This one is called Queen Nefertiti because it looks like an Egyptian headdress. You stare down the canyon there. Now, the secular geologists would say that all this was formed in the middle of the Jurassic period, which right about there, and then it's called the Entrada Sandstone. So when was the middle of the Jurassic period? You go back to this, and it says, oh, it was between 199 and 145 million years ago. Okay, well, we would say, no, formed during Noah's flood. As you continue to drive into the park, this one in the foreground is called the Organ. The one in the background here is called the Tower of Babel. This area is called the Fiery Furnace. Eventually, you find your way to the rear end of the park, and this is a satellite view again. We're going to get a little bit closer. Notice how these ridges in white are running from northwest to southeast, and they're called fins when you get out there, and they're just like these little ribbons of rock. Get a little closer, you see them. And then here, in this particular area, is what I have in this trapezoid, landscape arch. When you get down to the landscape arch, you look through it, and it looks like this. Landscape arch measures 290 feet across and only 77 feet high. Many people have thought that this would be the next arch to collapse because of this one little thin area right up there. It doesn't look like there's a whole lot holding up. But what actually happened not too long ago was this was wall arch prior to August 4th, 2008. Okay, not that many years ago. During the night it collapsed, and the next day when they went out, it looked like this. Okay, so this looked like a pretty sturdy arch compared to the other, and yet who knows when they're going to fall down. Now here's the thing. In all the time that people have been going to arches, they've seen arches collapse, but they have never seen an arch form. Okay, the processes that form an arch are not visible today. All we see is their demise. This is the most famous arch, called Delicate Arch, and for scale, there's somebody who looks like me standing there. Okay, and this picture here shows somebody that looks like my wife standing there, but it gives you an idea. In fact, Delicate Arch is so popular that if you ever notice a Utah license plate, that's what you're looking at. And if you were to look on the back side of it, it drops off into this big bowl shape there, and you can't, you wouldn't want to get out, you wouldn't want to fall down into that, let's just say, okay. Now, Mike Ord, who is with the Creation Research Society and with a couple other creationist organizations, he did a scientific article on this many years ago, in 2009 actually, and he's talking about the assumed uniformitarian origin is not observed. Now what he means by uniformitarian is processes that go on at the same rate. Okay, what we see today is what we measure the past by. Well, that's not reliable because that doesn't take into account that there may have been a catastrophic process. So in this article, Ord quotes an evolutionist named Crickmay, who notes that the bridges defy this uniformitarianism. Now he talks about them being weathered and collapsed, okay, and I'm not going to read all this stuff because it does get somewhat technical. He says no one has seen an arch formed by this mechanism, okay? So if you're going to believe that an arch forms this way, you have to take it on faith, okay? You have to take it on faith that this secular, non-Bible believing geologist says this is how it formed, okay? Or you can just trust God's word and look at some of the other evidence. He says arches would have formed during either the sheet flow or channelized flow phase of the retreating stage, while natural bridges probably formed during the channelized phase, okay? And we were talking about the channelized phase on that other illustration. It goes on to say there must be some factor that affects this, and so far for the evolutionists, it is an enigma, which means they haven't been able to solve it, okay? In other words, the long, slow, gradual processes don't cut it. If you look at the park brochure, it gives you this little illustration here, and it says, you know, you start off with rocks, and then they fracture, and then they weather a little bit, and then they weather out a little bit more, then they weather out a little bit more, and you have this. Well, essentially, that is the correct steps, but what they leave out is they say, this process here behind me took millions of years to happen. We say it happened in less than a year during the time of Noah's flood. Now, I have a very interesting video I want to share with you. This is from Awesome Science Media. They produce many good videos. We may have one or two produced by them out there. This is their logo, and this is their executive producer and director. This is Kyle Justice. And several years ago, when his son Noah was 12 years old, he started filming a series of geological videos. And they come with this, and it's Noah Justice at the Grand Canyon, at Yellowstone, Meteor Crater, Yosemite. They also have one with him in arches, and he's going to explain some very interesting scientific research done that people can observe that might explain this process of arch formation a little bit better. Let's see if it's all working here.
The fact that bridges and arches are not forming today, but have formed at a high rate in the past, would give good motivation for believing in catastrophic processes, such as the global flood as described in the Bible.
A recent lab experiment at Charles University in Prague might also give clues for another model of how the arches form. In this experiment, scientists submerged a piece of sandstone in water. A weight was put on top of the sandstone, then a funny thing happened. The water began to erode the softer parts of the submerged sandstone, but the harder parts of the sandstone stayed, causing an underwater arch to form. This experiment would fit well with the flood model. During the first 150 days of the flood, water would have laid down the sandstones quickly. They would have been saturated with water, while additional sediments were deposited on top of the sandstone. In this model, arches would have formed in these sediment layers. As the floodwaters receded, massive sheet erosion would have taken off the top layers and some of the sandstone underneath, leaving the arches.
Because of natural erosion over the past 4,000 years, the arches would have naturally become smaller and fewer, leaving only the 2,000 that we find in the park today.
When we use a catastrophic model to build arches, the observations make a lot more sense, rather than the slow and gradual processes proposed by naturalists. Arches National Park, a great testament to the global flood. Even though it was a global destruction, God left some pretty great formations for us to admire today.
Science, it's awesome.
And he ends all the time by saying, science, it's awesome. All right. So again, the layers would have been formed during the ascending phase, and then they would have been eroded out during the dispersive phase. On our visit there, we were out walking to some of these fins, and that's what it looks like. We met somebody from, I believe they were from Great Britain, weren't they? And took this picture of us standing there. This is Double Arch, and this is a little tiny person right there, standing in front of there. Now, to get to Arches National Park, you have to go through the town of Moab, unless you come in from the north. If you are ever in the town of Moab, I highly recommend you eat at Pasta J's restaurant. Great pasta. They even have gluten-free options if you have to deal with that. So must eat there, Pasta J's. Okay, moving along, we're going to swing up to Dinosaur National Monument. Dinosaur National Monument. It's a fossil bone quarry. You get there, you arrive there, you check in at the visitor center. You're greeted by this Stegosaurus here. You check in, you pay your fee for the tour and whatever. You get on the tram that looks like this, and they take you up to this exhibit area. Now, as you're going up to this exhibit area, you will see around you that the rock layers in this area are tilted very steeply. In fact, some of them, this one is measured at about a 54-degree angle. Okay, so these rock layers were all laid down, they were horizontal, but the earth movements in this area cause these things to tip up. And that's what you find on one of the rock walls. There are hundreds and hundreds of dinosaur bones. Many of them have been disarticulated, which means they were pulled apart, so they're not like one whole skeleton in one place, although there are a few of those that are only moderately broken up, but a lot of them are just in jumbles of pieces. And here's another picture. Kind of hard to see, I know, but if you go online and type Dinosaur National Monument, you'll see a lot of different pictures there. This one's a little bit more evident. But what they tell you, but they don't emphasize, is that mixed in with all these dinosaur bones are also marine fossils, such as clams. Now, were the dinosaurs swimming with the clams, or did the clams crawl up and hang out with the dinosaurs? Okay, they're all buried in the same sedimentary layer. Okay, a global flood easily explains that. They even have one here that you can see that they encourage you to touch. You can go right up and touch a real partially fossilized, not completely fossilized dinosaur bone. Now, let's take a look at some of this area here. This is taken from the park. We're going to focus on that square right there and take a look at how those layers are just swooped up, like woof, like so. Bent sedimentary layers imply that the layers were all soft at the time they were laid down and soft while they were being folded, okay? If it took millions of years, then the rocks would have broken. You can't take a popsicle stick or a twig or something like that and it's going to snap, okay? Well, if it's a green twig, it'll bend, okay? But we're talking about hard stuff, right? Like a rock would be after a million years. So, what happened here? Well, during the ascending phase, okay, these dinosaurs and other creatures are all getting trapped in the mud. And then, during the subbated phase, the sheet flow phase now, okay, it's stripping off the land and it's leaving big areas exposed. And so, there's no channelization here. Now, this Dinosaur National Monument is located outside of Vernal, Utah. While you're in Vernal, Utah, I highly recommend you take a little visit. It's only about 19 minutes, about 11 miles outside of town, a place called the McConkey Ranch, owned and operated by Bar V Bar Enterprises. It's a petroglyph site. It's open from dawn to dusk. When you pull into the nice little paved parking lot, there's a sign that says, "Welcome, $5 donation recommended per car." Okay, so you put $5 in the little green ammo box that they have a chain welded to. If you want a soft drink, you go over to the refrigerator, pull it out, put $1 in the thing. If you want to get a cap or a t-shirt, you can put a few more dollars in and take one off the rack that they have there. It's very nice. You take a map and you're able to walk along this little cliff behind the ranch, and you get to see, and I have seen, my wife and I visited many, many petroglyph sites all over the Southwest, and these are by far the most superior ones you'll ever see. A lot of them have little people that are like, yay tall or whatever. These petroglyphs, some of the people are like 5 and 6 feet tall. They have enormous trapezoidal breastplates and headdresses and things. And here's just what some of them look like. And this one here, and this one here, and this one's like, these are life size. And you can get right up close to them and take a look at them. Here's another one there. Some other ones here. Now, just to throw this in, when would this have happened? Well, this would have come about during this modern phase, okay? The flood is over, people are scattering out after the Tower of Babel, they make their way to the southwest and they start chipping on the rocks and putting these things in. Anyway, if you happen to be into petroglyphs at all, this is the place, this becomes your gold standard of petroglyphs, okay? And every other place is like, well, it's nice, but McConkey still wins out, in my view. I challenge you to go out there, and if you don't agree with me, then you can come back and chew me out, all right? So, we're going to head down now to Goblin Valley State Park in Utah. And Goblin Valley State Park is known for having very unusual, what are known as hoodoos, okay? These rock formations here. Now, these were supposedly the same Entrada sandstone that we saw back at Arches. It's supposed to be somewhere between 140 and 170 million years ago that they formed. But they're still out there. If they formed that long ago, why haven't they crumbled all into dust by now? Okay, they look like toadstools and mushrooms and other kind of weird shapes. Now, several geologists, even from a secular perspective, who study erosional rates have basically mathematically calculated that the Earth's continents should all erode down to sea level in about 15 million years. Well, if the dinosaurs died out 60 million years ago, that means that we would have washed out to the ocean 4 times, okay? And yet we still have dinosaur fossils, we still have rock layers like this. So when you account for all the variables, okay, the evolution will say, well, it could be as few as 8, but maybe as many as 50 million. Well, okay, even giving them the 8 million years, okay, again, the time scales they give you for these other features, they say, well, then why haven't these things all eroded away by now? So the fact that they're still there means they have to be young. They can't be millions of years old. Well, isn't that amazing? Has anybody ever seen the movie Galaxy Quest? Okay, there was a scene in Galaxy Quest that was filmed at Goblin Valley State Park. And just for fun, we'll watch a little bit of it here.
Hey, don't open that! It's an alien planet! Is there air? You don't know!
Seems okay.
Hey, I've been there several times. The air is just fine. There's really not a problem with it. And I didn't see any blue-skinned little aliens running around, but you can see that's kind of how they filmed it there and used, of course, special effects and graphics and things like that. They were looking for beryllium spheres to help power the craft to get them going. And then this guy, Tim Allen, he was chased by the rock monster and whatnot. But anyway, when you go to the park, you'll see this sign, and it says that this was seafront property at one time. Millions of years ago, about 170 million years, they say. And you see they got a little map and they think, oh, this area was, oh, okay. Yeah, this was the ocean. It was kind of doing whatever. And they say it was very tranquil, just kind of came in and, you know, washed things around a little bit and didn't do a whole lot of damage. They don't want to say it was catastrophic, okay? If they ever give any indication of a flood, it has to be very mild, very tame. Can't be very dramatic like the Bible says it was, because it was to destroy man from the earth, and every living thing that was not on the ark was destroyed. So a muddy tidal flat 770 million years ago. Well, we would have said that they formed again during the ascending, but this is that cross between the abative and the dispersive phase when these hoodoos would have been formed. There's in the sunset, there's these 3 people guarding you as you leave. As you move down to Capitol Reef National Park. Capitol Reef National Park is located on Scenic Route, well, it's where Scenic Route 12 intersects with the other Highway 24. And it's beautiful backcountry there. Some of the most remote area that you'll find in the United States. This is the Capitol Dome, which is where the Capitol Reef part of the name comes from. Here's another picture of it right here. The reef part comes from this feature here. This is known as the water pocket fold. It acted as a barrier to east-west travel. So all the people who were traveling over this area had to deal with this big thing here. It's what's known as a monocline, and a monocline, I'll put an illustration of that up, but it's the largest exposed monocline in North America. It's just under 100 miles long. It runs all the way down to Lake Powell. Here's another aerial picture taken by this guy here. Yeah. And, okay, so what is a monocline? A monocline is where you have faulting of the basement rocks, the solid rocks, the granites that would have been formed during creation, and the sedimentary rocks on top. Because they're soft, they flex and bend, they don't break, okay? So there's no, the fault that happens underneath doesn't run all the way up to the surface. So you have this, so they call a monocline, where it just kind of slopes down like so, okay? And that's what this is. Now, again, the people who go out there and investigate this, they say it was called the Capitol Reef. And why they call it a reef? Because when they look at it, they find fossilized clamshells and other things. Now, what are clams doing this far from the ocean? Well, that's why they have to say, well, there was this inland thing, you know, and all, you know, stuff like this, because we can't have clams. I mean, you're like 800 miles from the coast, okay, and yet you have these clams here. And this is, and if to get there, if you have a 4-wheel drive, a passenger vehicle would work if you have a fairly high ground clearance and it's dry and there hasn't been any rain for a while. It's along what's called the No-Tom Bullfrog Road. Anyway, oysters. You can go hiking up to this bridge here. the Hickman Bridge, it's known as. And this is a Chimney Rock. You can hike up to that too. Now, as you go through the park, there's something very interesting to see. You'll see these black rocks all over the place. These are called lava bombs. And some of them, there's some of them that are as small as a golf ball. Some of them are up to 9 feet in diameter, okay? These are basalt, which means they came from a volcano. They don't really know exactly which volcano it may have come from, but some of them are documented to have probably been hurled over 3,000 feet into the air from a volcano, because they had to go up into the air, spend enough time suspended in the air to cool off so that when they hit, they didn't just splatter, okay, that they stayed intact when they came down. There's no sedimentary layers on top of them, which means that this would have been a post-flood event, okay, and they're peppered all over the ground in some places. Now, when I was researching on this, I found that in November of 2010, there was a volcano in Iceland that was spitting these things out, and people were silly enough to watch it. But this guy in the airplane is going to take a video of them, and if you watch carefully, even from where you're at on whichever screen, you will see those little jets of steam as they're coming down, like this. And here are the people who paid money to stand out there and get spewed on by a volcano. I don't understand that. See another one coming down there. Several more are going to come out right there. So these are basalt projectiles being spit out of a volcano, and they go high in the atmosphere, like I say, and then they have enough time to cool off before they hit, and they pepper the landscape. You'll also, if you were to drive north of here and then like head up towards Oatman, you'll see some smaller ones alongside the road there as well. But they're much bigger and all over the place in Capitol Reef National Park. There's no admission to get into Capitol Reef unless you want to go down to visit the Grand Wash area, because the highway runs through it and they can't just make everybody pay a toll to get through on the highway. But, you know, get yourself a pass and you're good to go. So, the ascending phase, when all the layers are laid down, and the lava bombs would have been during this residual phase. The floodwaters have come off, but you still have volcanoes going off for hundreds of years and putting all kinds of stuff into the air. And again, that ties in directly to the Ice Age, but we can't even spend time going into that here. I suppose maybe I should start working on a PowerPoint on the Ice Age. All right, our next stop is the Escalante Petrified Forest State Park, but to get there, you have to drive across, this is the Utah State Scenic Byway, you have to drive across a feature known as the Hogback. The Hogback, this video was taken by a guy called the Flip Flop Wanderer. He's driving his car, and he has a drone that he has programmed to follow his car as he's driving along. But you're going along a ridgeline here, and it's about 1,200 feet down on both sides of you. And when we first visited there several years ago, it was 2 lanes with narrow shoulders, and you have people stopping to want to take photographs. They've widened it, and they've made several turnouts now for people, but at this point he stops, and he repositions the drone, and now he's going to take off again. So very cool to drive across there and to be up there and to think, oh yeah, there were people out there who have been doing this for years. Now these roads back in this area here were not even paved until the 1970s. Okay, it was that remote. There were just little farming communities back there, and in the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. So to get to the Escalante Petrified Forest State Park, it has a lot of the features that our own Petrified Forest National Park has. If you go hiking on the trail, they have little interpretive signs, and you can read about the different plants and things that grow there. But here, you're walking right in the midst of all of these rocks, and they're every bit as beautiful as some of the ones we have here. Takes you out to this hanging valley, which again would have been carved. You have water moving this way, carving this valley, and then more water coming out and dropping it this way. I'm taking this picture here just to give you an idea of the size. Some of these are right in the middle of the path, and you have to literally clamber over them and slide down and polish them with your jeans that you're wearing. Here's some of the colors. I had somebody set me up with this here, the origin of colors in petrified wood, and here's, you can see what some of the different elements. Black comes from carbon or manganese, gray can come from carbon or manganese, green usually from copper or chromium, sometimes iron. red from iron, orange from iron, yellow from iron, tan, pink, purple, white, blue. A lot of these come from iron, but a lot of the yellow, what you don't see on here, is that a lot of the yellow can come from uranium, okay? Because uranium in its raw form is sometimes called yellow cake, okay? And there's a lot of uranium mining up around this area too. So, anyway, just a little something to think about. I doubt that anybody goes up there with a Geiger counter and says, oh, it's not safe to be here, So again, when would petrified logs have happened? Well, most of it all starts in the ascending phase, but then those logs have to be buried and they have to be re-exposed. And since they're not down in a canyon necessarily, I put it somewhere between the abative and the dispersive phase. Next up, Kodachrome Basin State Park, one of our favorite places to go. Kodachrome Basin State Park, anybody been there? Okay, a few hands. Might want to check it out. Kodachrome Basin is notably known for these pipes or these chimneys. Now, for the most part, these pipes or these chimneys, there's like several of them. There's about 60 in the park, but there's about 100 in various places in southern Utah. Mostly they're gray, but sometimes there's a little bit of red mixed into them. They vary in size from a few feet across to, the biggest one is 53 feet in diameter, okay? And the tallest one is 172 feet tall. Now, what's interesting is that what they have identified is that the layer that these rocks come from is not the same as the layer around them. For the most part, these, like I say, are a light gray, but the area around there is reddish, okay? Here's an example of one of them. You can see it's very light, but yet there's all these red rocks around it. So, the Entrada sandstone was the Carmel Formation, is the underlying rock, okay? And the area around that you see that's red is called the Entrada sandstone, and it's supposed to be dated at 166 million years old. Okay, so if you subtract, that makes a difference of 13 million years. So what they're suggesting, okay, is that all the rock below, this lighter colored rock, stayed uncemented for 13 million years, and then earthquakes caused it to shoot up and then solidify, and then somehow all of this area got scoured away and left those pipes. Okay, is that sounding a little fishy to you? Okay, how would rock stay soft for 13 million years and then find its way up? And then, see, and they have to have millions of years because now you have to have time for the pipes to form as well as the erosion of everything else. But if the layers were laid down on top of each other, okay, and this layer down here, this Entrada sandstone, happens to have a little more tighter cementing agent, it's going to hold up a little bit better when those floodwaters scour everything out of the way. And all you need is some small variances in the percentage of silica in the sandstone to make the cementing even harder. As you're driving out of the park, there's this one here. My wife and I like to call this the candle and a cupcake. Okay, when you look at it, it's really kind of interesting to look at. And they have a campsite there, and this is the campsite that we want to catch on our next visit. Hopefully, we'll be able to book that when we go up there next. Anyway, from a biblical geologic model, again, these layers were laid down during the ascending phase and scoured away during the abative phase. We next go to Bryce Canyon National Park. Our first visit there was in March. It had snowed recently. Bryce Park was named after a guy named Ebenezer Bryce, who tried keeping cattle in the area because he figured, I just have to keep fences on one side and then the rest of the canyon will keep them there. But it's such a labyrinth of places to go. The cows would get back in there and they would get lost and they would moo and he'd hear them echoing and he couldn't figure out which canyon they were in. So he gave up cattle ranching and left. But this is a picture of the Bryce Amphitheater. This is a natural bridge, elevation 8,627 feet. This is called Thor's Hammer. You can hike on something called the Navajo Loop Trail, and it's what it looks like from the top. It's a series of switchbacks that goes down, 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 down into this nice little meadowed area. This is kind of what it looks like on the Google Maps 3D. Now, I'm going to show you a panoramic view simply because it's too big to squeeze it all into one slide because it's very long and very narrow, and if I try to put it all in one slide, then it had to be so, a lot less tall. I have a single bright line, kind of bluish on one screen, greenish on the other, And it represents the Kaibab limestone, which is the top layer of the Grand Canyon of the North Rim, okay? We're going to follow that up into Utah. So if I start it here, and I'll point out, it's this line right here. Okay, we follow it, Jacob Lakes right there. It goes down, and then you begin to see, all of a sudden, it's not the top layer anymore. It's way down here, okay? But then you've got, all the way up here is Cedar Breaks, Bryan Head, and Bryce Canyon. So, what do we have? From this layer up to this layer, okay, covers approximately, whoa, excuse me, I went too fast, 10,000 feet of sediment. That's almost 2 miles of sediment on top of what we see when we go to the Grand Canyon. But they've been bent and folded. You can see how they kind of bent down that way. So you're not gaining 2 miles in elevation. If you were to flatten out all these layers and make them straight, it would look like this. And again, this distance here is about 10,000 feet of sediment. So when you get to the Grand Canyon and you're looking at those layers, you're just looking at the beginning of the story, okay? There was a whole lot more sediment laid down. And again, at the end of the flood, all those layers were swept away. But fortunately for us, who live in Arizona, it's just to the north of us, and we can see these layers. Now, here's an interesting thing. From this point here at Bryce Canyon to the north rim of the Grand Canyon is only about 100 miles as the crow flies. Okay, so we're talking about a lot of sediments laid down and a lot of erosion. But evolutionists, for the most part, there are a few who will dabble with it, but for the most part, when you ask them to explain how all those other layers got laid down and how they all got eroded, they'd really rather not talk about it, okay? But we don't have to be afraid to talk about it, because we can say, of course, from a global flood perspective, it all makes really good sense. But you have to start with the belief that the Bible is true. So, again, layers are laid down during the ascending phase, but it's this abative phase process that most of those layers were scoured away. And keep in mind, there were earth movements going on and stuff like this. That's why they would have gotten bent and down that way. So you're not gaining 10,000 feet in elevation. Next up is Zion National Park. But before we get to Zion National Park, I want to show you, I mentioned Cedar Breaks back there. We're going to take a little detour off the track. We're going to go over here to Cedar Breaks National Monument. And the sign looks like this. When you go in, you see the same formations. You're on the other side of this mountain, but the formations look pretty much essentially identical to those over in Bryce Canyon. It's a much smaller national monument. You're at about 9,000 feet. You better plan to be there in the summer, because it gets mighty cold in the winter up there. Now there are, like I say, for the most part, there are some identical features, but this area, Cedar Breaks, has something very unusual that doesn't show up most other places. It's this tree. Can anybody identify this particular tree? This is a bristlecone pine tree, supposedly the oldest living thing on the planet. Now, how old are these supposedly oldest living things on the planet? Well, according to the USDA website, they are 4,789 years old. But the Earth is supposed to be 4.2 billion years old. So what is going on here? Well, let's start off right now with the year 2024. And let's subtract 4,789 years to when these trees were first started growing. That would have put them to be basically saplings or seedlings at the year 2765 BC. Now, if we start with Bishop Ussher's estimate of the age of the Earth, and he says that according to the biblical calculations, and there's other people who vary, but I'll just take his, the common date was 4004 BC was when the Garden of Eden was created and all this was put into place. And then the flood came along 1,656 years later. So if starting with these numbers and working forward, that puts us at the year 2348 BC. So what we're looking at here is only a difference of 417 years. Okay, that's easily enough time for bristlecone pine seeds to find their way to certain areas and get embedded and to start growing. Okay, so it's not entirely unlikely that that could have happened. But if the Earth is 4.2 billion years old, why isn't there something older than just 4,700 years old? Why does the origin of the oldest living thing put it within really close range of the biblical flood? Well, if the biblical flood is true, it's not a problem at all. If you believe in millions of years, you got a problem to say, well, why isn't there anything older than that? If you enter Zion National Park, now we're back on the road, This is from the east entrance, and when you come into the east entrance, one of the first things you see is this called Checkerboard Mesa. It's made out of Navajo sandstone. It has horizontal and vertical lines to make it look kind of like a checkerboard, okay? The interesting thing is, when they examine this rock, they say, where did this particular rock come from? And believe it or not, even secular geologists will say that the sand from these came from the Appalachian Mountains, clear across the country. Now, what would transport sand grains 2,000 miles across the continent? It wasn't a meandering stream, and it wasn't local monsoons, okay? It had to have been a global catastrophic flood. But again, this is an uncomfortable fact for evolutionists that they don't really like to try to speculate. They just say, well, it just happened, it got here, okay? Now, as you enter Zion National Park, and I haven't asked who's been there or who hasn't been there, but this is the tunnel. You have to go through a tunnel, and then you get to the station, because they only let people go through in one direction at a time because vehicles have gotten bigger over the time. And no bikes or pedestrians allowed. And then you have this here, looking at through the tunnel, and as you're driving through the tunnel, you'll sometimes see a window, and you get to look out on some of these rock formations. From the outside, it looks kind of like this. When you get all the way through, and at the bottom, it looks like this. And when you get out of the tunnel, you are looking here. This is called the West Temple and the Altar of Sacrifice, because it looks like blood has come down the thing here. This is the Great White Throne, and there's a trail to take you up to an area right across from there called Angel's Landing. And you start hiking up what's called the West Rim Trail. You come to this spot right here, and you take a little bit of a break because there's a very cool breeze that's blowing right at you. This is called Refrigerator Canyon. My wife and I stopped here, and again, this was another person from Great Britain who said, I'll take your picture, and we took his, and they took ours, and whatnot. But you turn around, and this is what you're hiking into. This is Refrigerator Canyon, and amazingly, there's just a nice, refreshing breeze, and by the time you've gotten that far, you're ready for a cool breeze anyway. You get to a spot where it turns around, and you have to start climbing back up the other way. And look at these formations here. You have what's known as cross beddings. You have layers being laid out at this angle, and at this angle, and that angle. Okay, then you have this big curvy thing right up there. So all of this would have been soft and sedimentary as these formations are being formed. These things are being pushed around. You're going to have earthquakes going on, all kinds of things. And so this soft clay-like mud, clay-like rock, is still being formed. But this cross-bedding means that you have a lot of different interesting tidal forces at work going on. So you're at the end of Refrigerator Canyon, you turn around, and you have to start climbing a place called Walter's Wiggles. It's a series of switchbacks which take you up to Scout's Landing. And when you get to Scout's Landing, you're then looking out to say, do I want to go out to Angel's Landing? Okay? And if you should decide to do that, when you get to Angel's Landing, it looks like this. You're looking down into Zion National Park, and that's the Virgin River down below. And if you look right across the canyon, you will see the Great White Throne. And just to prove that I was really up there, there's a picture of me with perspiration on my t-shirt. And there's students in the back there. They were from Washington University in St. Louis. They were attending medical school there. If you go to the other portion of Zion National Park, you have to go out to St. George, get on the Interstate 15 and drive up, and then there's a place called Kolob Canyon. When you get to Kolob Canyon, they have these things here called hanging valleys. Now, how does the hanging valley form? I mentioned this earlier at the other Escalante Grand Staircase State Park. You have, during this recess, this abative phase going on, you have water scouring out and making big channels this way, and then you have a place then for the water that's been trapped up here to come out this way. And there's oftentimes waterfalls this way, but you have water moving in two different directions, okay? The big scouring going this way, smaller scouring coming down that way. They were formed during the ascending, and they were formed, and then they were carved during the dispersive phase. We're getting close to the end here, folks. Stay with me. We're going to go to Coral Pink Sand Dunes State Park. And what do you see at Coral Pink Sand Dunes State Park except coral pink sand dunes, okay? All over the place. It looks like a whole bunch of paprika or something, okay? And you can trudge around out there if you want to. And then you see this sign that says, why are the dunes here? Well, here's what it says, okay? It says, gather white sand, cover with ocean, add iron oxide, let it sit 170 million years. Does anybody see a problem with that? Okay. Well, here's what the park looks like. Now, here's the problem. Do you see these hills in the background? According to secular geology, they should have eroded away 15 million years ago. But they're still there. And isn't that interesting? Well, there they are. Now, there are many inland sand dune locations in the world. Why is it that none of them are turning into stone before our eyes? Okay. Well, they say the continents had to be submerged to bring in the ocean waters. Okay. Well, we've seen numerous examples of these thick sandstone layers, but what we also see is that they are flat between each layer. Flat, 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 flat. But this doesn't look flat. Okay. If you're going to make this into a petrified piece of rock layer, then you have to level it all out first. Well, that's where the ocean comes in. Well, we don't see oceans going. So what does that mean? It means that to believe that this took millions of years to form, you have to take it on faith. Well, if you're going to take man, fallible, sinning, erring human being's word, or you're going to take God's word, who do you think you should throw in with? I vote for God, okay? And, oh, do I need an arrow here? Talk about this would have been after the flood, okay? This is an area that didn't receive enough cementing to do this. And the sandstone that's around there is constantly being eroded away anyway. So it looks like I have to put another arrow to talk to people about where that went. Outside of St. George, Utah, we're getting near the end here, folks, is Snow Canyon State Park. It is not named because of the snow. It's because of named by a fellow by the name of Snow, okay? Just like the town of Snowflake, Arizona was founded by two guys named Snow and Flake. All right, so Snow Canyon State Park, that is actually true. If you go to Snowflake, they'll tell you that. Anyway, there's lots of unusual rock formations around there, okay? There's hundreds of very thin layers. There's all kinds of cross-bedding of things. Here's some examples again of cross-bedding. There was a lava flow that flowed over this area. It's on top of everything, so we can say right away this lava flow would have been a post-flood event because there's no sedimentary layers on top of it. It covers several acres, and where you have lava flows, sometimes you get lava tubes, okay, which you can crawl in and explore, and they're nice and cool down there when it's hot out. Now, do you remember back in Zion we talked about checkerboard mesa? Well, Snow Canyon has an inverted checkerboard mesa. They call it the Snow Canyon Amphitheater. Same kind of rocks, only instead of being a mountain, it's a bowl. And you can climb into that. Now, isn't that just a little bit interesting too? All right. It was built during the ascending, cut during the dispersive, and then the lava flows would have been this residual post-flood phase. Okay. Now, let's get back to God's word in closing here. Psalms 104, verse 8, it says that the mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them, describing the geological process that brought the flood to an end. Okay, mountains came up, valleys sank down. That would have included the ocean basins, and they would have sunk down because once those fountains of the great deep finished and the plates quit moving, then the ocean basins would have gone lower, and that's how all the water has a place to go. So when people ask, oh yeah, well where's all the water from Noah's flood? You can say it's just out there in the ocean. Many people say that if you took the earth, all of the land on earth, and flattened it all out as flat as you could, like a cue ball, there would be enough water in all the earth's oceans to cover the earth 1.7 miles deep. Okay, so when you're looking at the water, you're only looking at the top. You're not even looking down inside of it. Luke 19, verse 40, he, being Jesus, answered, I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out. And we can say, yes, in this case, these rocks do have something to say. And to understand what they're saying, all we have to do is put on our biblical glasses and look at these things, and we can say, wow, it's amazing. I see evidence of global flood everywhere. And you do this, and you take a couple of little, you don't have to take big, lengthy road trips. You can just drive from here to Flagstaff, and you can see enough things to say, this had to have been formed by catastrophic processes. And so when you have your biblical glasses on, you can say that geology is fun. And it can be incredibly fun. And you don't need a college degree to appreciate it either, okay? Like I say, young people third graders, fourth graders can be taught to look at these things from this perspective and be able to analyze that. God's word says, John 17:17, thy word is truth. This is Jesus speaking, and he's praying to his Father. He's saying, Father, sanctify them in the truth. Thy word is truth. My hope is that this presentation this evening, that you take away from here something that will inspire you to believe even more in the truth and the authority of God's word, his holy Bible. And when you're out just driving around, you begin to see things with a new eye and a new perspective to say, wow, a global flood really does explain a lot of things. And you can see it right here in Arizona. And if you happen to want to take a trip to Utah, again, that's up to you. And I thank you for your attendance. We have time for question and answers. I see that look that tells me everybody feels like they have been drinking from a fire hose. Okay? Or maybe like this little girl here, I don't know. Questions and answers.